They had written her into the estate contract as an arrangement. Not a name with a history, not a woman with a family and a claim, but an arrangement. A single line of text wedged between the inventory of the wine cellar and the schedule of outstanding debts, as though she were a liability like the rest and not a living person who had grown up sleeping in the room, directly above the one where the lawyers were now drinking her father's port. The line read, Ann Colby, seamstress, retained at house, no fixed wage bound by prior arrangement, transfer with estate. Joanna Aldwell, who had spent the last 8 months calling herself Ann Colby, answering to that name without flinching, rising at 5 to light the kitchen fires, and going to bed long after the last candle in the house was snuffed, read those words upside down from across the room and kept her hand still. She had learned stillness here, the way you learn anything difficult, by practicing it until it cost you nothing. The lawyers had laid the contracts out on the long table in the library, her father's library. The books on those shelves were ones he had read to her. She knew the crack in the spine of the 3rd volume of the commentaries. She knew the window behind the solicitor's left shoulder, stuck in damp weather, and had to be lifted from the bottom. She had known every inch of this house since she was 4 years old, and for the past 8 months she had been cleaning it on her hands and knees. And no one had once thought to ask why a seamstress might know the servants' passages better than the housekeeper did. She had not come back to clean floors. She had come back because her father's solicitor, Mr. Crick, had filed a document 2 years ago, claiming that Joanna Aldwell was illegitimate, born outside the marriage, entitled to nothing. The document was witnessed. It was stamped. It had stood up in a county court, and on the strength of it, her father's estate had passed to his younger brother, Phineas Aldwell, who had accepted it with every appearance of a man receiving his rightful due. Joanna knew the document was a forgery. She had no way yet to prove it. The original marriage certificate, her parents', had been in this house. She was nearly certain of it. Her mother had mentioned it once, in a letter Joanna still carried folded inside her boot. Everything that proves us is in the library, behind the place your father always said was the worst spot for a painting. The letter had been written a week before her mother died. Joanna had been 17. She had not understood what it meant until 2 years later, standing outside the county courthouse in the rain, holding a judgment that told her she did not exist. She had applied for a position as seamstress under the name Ann Colby. She had been hired because Phineas Aldwell's housekeeper needed someone who could alter the window curtains and not ask questions, and because Phineas himself had never paid enough attention to the staff to wonder whether any of them had business being there. For 8 months she had searched. She had worked through every book in the library, checked behind every painting, pressed every panel of the wainscoting while the house slept. She had found nothing, except that she was beginning to understand her mother's words differently. The worst spot for a painting, and that she needed more time than she had. Because now Phineas was selling the estate and the lawyers were here, and they had written her into the sale documents as a transfer item, like the wine cellar and the debts. And now a 4th carriage had turned up the drive, and the room had changed. She felt the change before she understood it. Phineas came out of his chair too quickly. Mr. Crick gathered his papers with the focused urgency of a man who suddenly needed to look competent. The junior clerks straightened. A name went around the room in a murmur that reached even the corner where Joanna stood with her sewing basket. The reason she had found to be in this room, the reason that kept her hands occupied and her presence unremarkable. The Duke of Stanhope. She had heard the title, of course. Everyone in 3 counties had heard of the Duke of Stanhope. What she had not heard was that he was the buyer. Phineas had kept that close, had told no one, she suspected, because the name alone would have raised questions about what kind of ruin drove a man to sell an ancestral estate to one of the most powerful peers in the North. The Duke was younger than she expected when he came through the door, younger and quieter. He did not carry himself the way powerful men usually did in her experience, as though the room were already his before he entered it. He came in and he looked at the table, and he crossed to it, and the lawyers moved aside for him without quite realizing they were doing it. He picked up the contracts. Joanna watched him read. He read the way she searched the library, methodically, without hurrying, moving from one page to the next with the patience of a man who expects to find something and is in no rush because he knows it will be there. Phineas was speaking. Phineas was always speaking when there were important men in the room, filling the silence with the sounds of himself, describing the property, the acreage, the quality of the stables. The Duke of Stanhope gave no sign of hearing any of it. He reached the third page. She watched his eyes move down the column of retained staff and arrangements. He stopped. She saw him stop, saw his eyes fix on a point about 2/3 down the page, saw him read whatever was there once, and then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who does not often need to do things twice, read it again. The room had not gone quiet exactly, but something in its texture had shifted, the way the air changes just before weather. The Duke looked up from the contract. He did not look at Phineas. He looked at Mr. Crick. "Who drew up this arrangement?" he said. "The one for the seamstress." Mr. Crick cleared his throat. "I did, Your Grace. From Mr. Aldwell's existing household records. It's a long-standing arrangement, entirely in order." "Whose name is on it?" "Anne Colby, Your Grace. A seamstress. She's been with the household 8 months. The arrangement transfers with the estate as part of the retained staff." The Duke looked at the page again. Not long, 3 seconds, perhaps 4. "I see," he said. And his voice gave away nothing at all. And that was the thing Joanna would remember about that moment. The way those 2 words told her absolutely nothing about what he intended to do with them. He turned to the next page. Phineas began talking about the stables. That evening, when the lawyers had gone and the house was settling into its nighttime quiet, Joanna sat in the kitchen and tried to understand what she had seen. Ruth, the old cook who had known her mother, who had kept her own counsel for 8 months without once giving her away, was at the stove with her back turned, stirring something that didn't need stirring. "He noticed me," Joanna said. Ruth didn't turn around. "I know." He read the clause twice. He asked who drew it up. "I know that too. Heard it from the passage." Joanna pressed her palms flat on the kitchen table. "What does it mean?" Ruth set down the spoon. She turned, and her expression was one Joanna had not seen from her in 8 months. Not quite pity, not quite hope, but the particular look of a woman who has been watching a thing develop for a long time and is now deciding whether to say what she knows. "It means," Ruth said carefully, "that he's a man who reads what's in front of him, all of it, not just what he expects to find. That doesn't tell me what he'll do." "No," Ruth agreed. "It doesn't." She pulled out the chair across from Joanna and sat down, which she almost never did at this hour. "But his man came to the kitchen door while you were upstairs, a quiet fellow, very proper. Said the Duke would return tomorrow morning and wished to speak privately with the woman listed in the retained staff arrangement." She folded her hands on the table. "Not the seamstress. The woman listed. Now, you've been living under a dead woman's name for 8 months, and you haven't told me the whole of it, because you thought it was safer that way. But I knew your mother since before you were born, and I know her handwriting in the set of your jaw. If a duke is asking for you, not for the seamstress, then I think perhaps it is time to tell me the rest, and then you'll go into that library tomorrow with your head up, Whatever he asks of you, you answer him straight. You do not fold. Do you hear me?" So Joanna told her. The forged document, the court ruling, the letter her mother had left, 8 months of searching the library, panel by panel, while the house slept, the marriage certificate she still hadn't found. Ruth listened without interrupting. When it was done, she said only, "Your father wrote to people, you know, when he was justice of the peace, important people. There was a property dispute. Some years back, a northern estate. The other party was claiming rights that weren't theirs, and your father ruled against them, quite firmly, in favor of the legitimate owner." She looked at her steadily. "I remember, because the letter of thanks that came back was finer paper than anything that usually arrived here, sealed with a crest. In the morning, Joanna washed her face in cold water and put on the better of her 2 plain dresses. She pinned her hair up simply, the way a seamstress would. She looked at herself in the small mirror in the attic room and thought, "Whoever this woman is supposed to be, she is not what you are. But she has survived this far. She can survive one more morning." She went down to the library at 9:30 and waited. The Duke of Stanhope arrived at 10, alone. He came in and closed the door behind him, and it was just the 2 of them in the room full of her father's books, with the winter light coming gray and flat through the window that always stuck in damp weather. She saw now that she could look at him properly, a man of perhaps 32, dark-haired, plainly dressed for his rank. His face gave little away, but it did not look unkind, and she had prepared herself so thoroughly for unkindness that its absence almost wrong-footed her. He stood across from her and did not sit, and so she did not sit either, and they faced each other over a few feet of the old carpet she had helped beat clean last October. "You know who I am," he said. "The Duke of Stanhope, Your Grace." "And do you know why I asked to see you?" "No, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment. It was not the kind of look she was used to in this house. Not dismissive, not the look men gave the hired help when they remembered she was there. It was a careful look, the look of a man comparing what stood before him to something he was carrying in his memory. "Your arrangement," he said, "the one that transfers you with the estate, it is not legal. A person cannot be passed from one owner to another in a property sale, not in any form that would stand up. The clause as written is void. Either Mr. Crick knew that and hoped no one would notice, or he didn't know it and is not fit to be drawing up contracts of this nature." A pause. "I suspect the former." Joanna said nothing. "The name in the contract," he said. "Ann Colby. Is that your name?" She met his eyes. Ruth had told her, "Stand as you are. Don't fold. Answer him straight. No, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. He had not looked like a man expecting to be surprised. Something more like a door opening inward. "What is your name?" She told him. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it, in that room. "Aldwell," the Duke said. He said it the way you say a word you have not spoken aloud in a long time, testing whether it still sounds the way it did. "Your father, was he Justice Thomas Aldwell of this county?" "He was." The Duke crossed to the desk, her father's desk, which Phineas had not bothered to replace with his own, and produced a folded letter from his coat, not from any drawer. From his coat, where he had evidently been carrying it. "6 years ago," he said, "a solicitor acting on behalf of a neighboring estate attempted to claim a right-of-way through Stanhope's southern pastures. It was not a legitimate claim, but it was cleverly filed and would have taken years to untangle in the ordinary courts. Your father, as Justice of the Peace, ruled on a procedural matter that cut through the whole of it in a single afternoon. He held out the letter. I wrote to thank him. He wrote back. I have kept the correspondence because your father's reply contained something I did not expect. a frank account of how he had approached the matter. It was one of the finer pieces of legal reasoning I have encountered from a man of any court. Joanna took the letter, her father's handwriting. His hand, which she had not seen in 2 years, steady and precise on the page, the letters of a man who believed that the words he wrote meant exactly what he said they did. She could not speak for a moment. "I did not know he had died," the Duke said quietly, "until I began making inquiries about this estate and found the transfer records. I did not know about the illegitimacy claim until I read the contracts." He looked at her carefully. "I assume you are here because the claim was false." "It was forged," Joanna said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The original marriage certificate proving my parents were married before I was born is somewhere in this house. My mother told me. I came back to find it." She looked at him. 8 months. I have searched every shelf of this library and every panel I could reach without drawing attention. I haven't found it yet, but I know it is here." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "Show me where you haven't looked." She stared at him. "You said you've searched every shelf, every panel, but there may be one thing you didn't know to look for." He crossed to the far wall, to the paneling beside the fireplace, where a landscape painting hung. A view of the north pastures in autumn, quite possibly the worst painting in the county, and the one her father had never been able to bring himself to sell. "Your father wrote to me once," the Duke said, "that the worst thing in his library was a landscape a great-aunt had sent him, and that he kept it because it covered a damp patch in the plaster the wall was too old to fix." Joanna looked at the painting. Her mother's letter, behind the place your father always said was the worst spot for a painting. She crossed the room. Behind the landscape, which was indeed terrible, 2 lopsided trees and a horizon that didn't quite lie flat, was a panel seam she had never noticed because the painting's frame overlapped it on all 4 sides. The Duke ran his fingers along the edge and pressed at the lower corner. The panel moved inward half an inch, then swung. Behind it was a narrow shelf. On the shelf lay an oilskin-wrapped package tied with a cord. Joanna's hands shook when she untied it. The marriage certificate was there, her parents' names in the old parish hand, the date 12 months before her own birth, the witnesses' signatures, the seal of the county church. Perfect, complete. Exactly what Phineas had forged a document to pretend did not exist. She was still holding it when the library door opened. Phineas Aldwell stepped in with Mr. Crick at his elbow and 2 of his own lawyers behind him, and the smile on his face told Joanna immediately that whatever advantage she had just found, he had been warned she might find it and had come prepared. "Your Grace," he said pleasantly, "forgive the interruption. I was told you were meeting with the retained staff, and I thought perhaps I ought to be present, given that any discussion touching on the estate should properly include its current owner." His eyes went to the document in Joanna's hands. The smile did not change. "And what is that, Anne?" "Her name is not Anne," the Duke said. "It is in the contract," Phineas said. "The contract is void." Phineas turned from the Duke to Joanna with the patience of a man who has played a thing through in advance and knows how it ends. "Your Grace, I appreciate your concern for the staff, truly, but that woman is not who she may have led you to believe. Her name is not Aldwell. She has no claim to this estate. The county court settled the question of succession 2 years ago. The documents are filed. The ruling stands." He reached into his coat and produced a stamped copy of the court order. She recognized the seal, had nightmares about the seal, and laid it on the desk. "An illegitimate child has no inheritance rights. That is the law. Whatever that woman has found in this library is my property, and I'll thank her to set it down." The Duke looked at the court order. He looked at the marriage certificate in Joanna's hands. He looked at Phineas. "Bring your solicitor in, Mr. Crick," he said. I have something to show you." What followed was 2 hours that Joanna could only remember afterward in pieces. The marriage certificate was examined and challenged. Phineas produced a counter-document suggesting it was a forgery, with suspiciously convenient speed, as though it had been prepared in advance. The court ruling was cited. Phineas's lawyers cited it again. At the end of it, Phineas held up his hand and said, reasonably and pleasantly, the way he did everything, "This is a matter for the courts, not a library. His Grace may take whatever concerns he has before the county bench. In the meantime, this woman is on my property under a false name, which makes her a trespasser, and I am requesting that she be removed." The Duke's solicitor looked at the Duke. The Duke said nothing. Joanna looked at him and saw for the first time the face of a man who was not beaten, who was, in fact, entirely composed, and who was watching Phineas Aldwell with an expression of very quiet, very patient interest. She had seen that expression once before, yesterday when he had read her clause in the contract for the second time, and set it down. "I'll go," she said. Ruth had told her not to fold, but Ruth had not anticipated Phineas's lawyers or his prepared counter-documents. "Your Grace, thank you. Whatever comes of this—" "One moment," the Duke said. He crossed to the desk. He produced from inside his coat a folded document she did not recognize. Newer paper, his own solicitor's stamp at the margin. He opened it on the desk and turned it so Phineas, Mr. Crick, and the lawyers could read it. "Yesterday morning," he said, "before I signed the preliminary purchase agreement for this estate, I read all of the attached contracts, including the arrangement clause concerning the woman currently being asked to leave this room. I found it void, as I have said, and I did something about it before I put my name to anything." He pointed to the bottom margin of the document, where a line had been written in his own hand. "Read it, Mr. Crick. Aloud, if you would." Mr. Crick leaned over the desk. He read the line once, silently, and then looked up with the expression of a man who has just understood something unfortunate. "Aloud," the Duke said again, with perfect courtesy. Mr. Crick read, "The arrangement binding the woman named herein as Anne Colby is declared without legal foundation and void. I will not purchase the contract of any person. The individual so named is to be regarded as a free subject, her true status to be determined at law before any transfer of her person may be considered. This notation forms part of the signed purchase agreement and is witnessed accordingly. Stanhope." The library went very quiet. Phineas's expression did not fall. He was too careful a man for that. But something in his eyes shifted, the way it shifts in a man who has felt the ground move under him and is deciding whether to pretend it didn't. "That is yesterday's date," the Duke said. "Filed with my solicitor last evening by express. It is registered, it is witnessed, and it is in point of fact older than your removal order, Mr. Aldwell, by approximately 17 hours. He looked at Phineas steadily. "Your order names a woman retained by arrangement, something transferable with the estate. There is no such thing. There has been no such thing since I wrote that line, and the writing of it is recorded in the very document by which this estate was to change hands." A pause. "You cannot remove what does not exist. The woman standing in this library is not a seamstress retained by prior arrangement. She is a free subject with an open question about her identity, and that question is to be answered in an open court, not in a library, and not at your convenience." Phineas looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, the pleasantness was entirely gone, and what was left underneath was flat and cold, and, for the first time, honest. "You've no idea what you are wading into," he said. "The court has already ruled. My lawyers will bury you in it." "They may try," the Duke said. "I welcome it. Because an open proceeding is the one thing you cannot control, and you have spent 2 years controlling everything very carefully." He turned to his solicitor. File for a full review of the succession on the grounds of new evidence. Today. The open hearing took 3 weeks to arrange and 3 days to undo what Phineas had built over 2 years. It came apart the way forgeries always come apart eventually, not at the seams he had reinforced, but at the ones he had not thought to check. The witness who had signed the illegitimacy declaration turned out to have signed 3 other declarations for Phineas over the years, all conveniently timed, except one witness who was traced to a village 40 miles east and who, given the choice between perjury charges and honesty, discovered a thorough preference for honesty. The marriage certificate, when examined by a document specialist brought in from the capital, matched the parish register exactly, and the parish register, which no one had thought to pull, contained the original entry in the officiating minister's own hand, dated 12 months before Joanna's birth, perfectly intact. Phineas's counter-document, the one claiming the marriage certificate was forged, had been prepared, the court found, less than 1 week before the hearing. Not 2 years ago, not even 1 year ago, the week before, the ink composition said so. The succession was reversed, the estate was returned. There was a moment, after the judgment was read, when Joanna stood in the corridor outside the courtroom and did not quite know what to do with her hands. She had been doing something with her hands for 2 years, searching, working, holding herself together by main force, and now there was nothing to hold, no next move, no panel left to press. The Duke found her there. He did not say anything immediately. He stood beside her while the lawyers filed past, and the clerks gathered their papers, and he let the silence be what it was. The first silence in a very long time that did not have something hiding in it. "Your father's letter," he said finally. "The one I brought to you. I'd like you to keep it." She looked at him. "He wrote," the Duke said, "that the measure of a just ruling was not its elegance, but whether it could be explained plainly to the person most affected by it. He said that any argument a judge could not defend to the one who had to live with a result was an argument not worth making." A pause. "I have thought about that letter a great deal, more than he could have intended when he wrote it." Joanna thought of her father in his library, reading in the chair by the window, that stuck in damp weather. She thought of Ruth in the kitchen, not turning around. She thought of 8 months of rising in the dark, with nothing to hold on to but the certainty that the truth was there, that it only needed to be found. "Thank you," she said, "for reading the contract all the way to the end." "I always read to the end," he said. "Most people don't. It's where the important things get written." She thought of the line he had written in the margin of a contract that had tried to make her property. Before he knew her name, before he knew any of it, only because he had read something that a person of conscience could not sign without first refusing. "I wonder," she said, "what you thought you were doing when you wrote it, that morning, before you knew any of this." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "I thought," he said, "that a person listed in a contract of sale was a person who deserved at least one line acknowledging that fact, and that if no one else was going to write it, I might as well be the one." Ruth came to the estate when it was returned, as she had always intended to. She found Joanna in the library on the first morning, standing in front of the wall where the bad landscape had hung. The oilskin package was gone, the painting was down, the panel behind it stood open. "Your mother would have found a better hiding place," Ruth said. "My mother trusted my father's bad taste," Joanna said. "It served its purpose." Ruth looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd had in the kitchen 8 months ago. Not quite hope, not quite certainty, something between. "The Duke sent a letter this morning," she said. "Before 8 o'clock. That's a man who was awake thinking." Joanna did not answer, because Ruth had already turned back to the hallway, the way she always did when she'd said exactly enough. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Careful and precise, the way she was learning he did most things. The last paragraph asked a question she had not expected from a man who generally seemed to know in advance what answers he would receive. She wrote back. The correspondence continued through the winter and into the spring, by which time the bad landscape was still off the wall, and the window that stuck in damp weather had been fixed by a carpenter who knew what he was doing, and the library was hers again in every sense that mattered. They married in June, quietly, in the county church, where her parents' marriage was recorded in the register. Ruth wept and said she was not weeping. The Duke, Rupert, she called him now, which still felt new in her mouth and probably always would, said his vows in the same tone he used for everything. Plain, considered, as though he meant precisely what the words said and no more and no less. Afterward, in the library, she showed him the line he had written in the margin of the contract. She had kept it, the original, filed it herself with her own solicitor, separate from the estate papers, in a folder with her name on it and her mother's. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. I told you, he said, I always read to the end. She set the document back in the folder, in the drawer of her father's desk, in the library of the house that had been hers all along. Hidden for a while, but always hers. And she thought that perhaps the most important thing in the world was not to be the kind of person who looked away from the last line of anything, however small or cheap or easily overlooked it appeared. Her father had known that. He had written it down. She was glad, in the end, that someone else had read it. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. We would love to know which city you're listening from and what this story made you feel. If you'd like to hear more from June's stories, please subscribe. We have many more to share.